The first I knew that the sickness had reached us was the silence where the bell should have been. Every morning of my life the chapel bell had rung Holt's Bottom awake, 6 strokes, thin and cracked, old Brennan pulling the rope before he could feel his own hands in the cold. That morning there were 5 strokes, and then nothing, and the nothing went on so long that I came out into the lane in my nightshirt to look at the steeple, sure the rope had finally broken. It had not. Brennan had sat down on the step under the bell, the rope still in his fist, because he had not the strength in him to pull it a 6th time. I did not know that yet. I knew only that the village was too quiet, and that the quiet had a weight to it, the way the air has a weight before a storm comes down out of the hills. I should tell you who I am. My name is Wat Coombe. I was 44 that autumn, a mender of carts and a shoer of the few horses the valley still kept, and I had never been farther from Holt's Bottom than the market town of Carrow, 2 days down the river road. I am not a brave man. I want that plain from the start, because this is not a story I made myself the hero of. I was frightened nearly the whole way through it. The man who was not frightened, or who was and stood anyway, which I have since learned is a different and a harder thing, came to us by accident, and he did not have to stay. But I am ahead of myself. Let me tell it the way it came. Holt's Bottom sat at the dead end of the valley, where the river that had cut the whole green length of it finally lost its nerve against the mountains and turned to bog. There were perhaps 200 of us in good years. We grew what we could on the flat and grazed sheep on the slopes, and twice a year a few men walked the carts down to Carrow to sell wool. We were a long way from anything. The capital, where the king kept his house and his guard, was a name to us, a thing in stories, 11 days' hard travel and a world away. No one of consequence had ever come up our valley. No one of consequence had any reason to. That is the whole shape of what happened. We were the place the realm forgot it had, and the sickness found us there in the forgetting. It came up the river road the way everything came to us, slow and from below. A drover brought it, they said afterward, though no one could be sure and it did no good to blame him. A man passing through with a string of ponies for the Carrow fair, who stopped a night at the Ploughman and was gone by light, sweating and gray and saying it was nothing, only the road. Within the week 3 houses at the lower end had it. Within 2 weeks it had walked up the whole village, house to house, the way a fire walks a hedgerow, and we had given it a name out of plain fear, because a thing with a name is less than a thing without one. We called it the gray fever, for the color it put into a face, and for the ash-colored dawns that autumn, when the mist came off the bog and lay in the lane to your knees and would not lift till noon. I will not dwell on the sickness itself. There is no honor in it and no use in the telling, and I promised myself I would speak of it plainly, with the dignity owed to people who suffered and were not ashamed. It took the old first and the very young, as such things do. It came on with a heat and a heaviness, and a thirst that water did not touch, and then a quiet that was the worst of it, because a body that has been moaning in the night and then goes quiet is not always a body that is mending. Some it took in 3 days. Some it wrestled a fortnight and let go, weak as a wrung cloth, to mend slow into the winter. And some, by a mercy no one could explain, it walked past entirely, leaving them whole to do the carrying and the watching and the burying. I was one of those it walked past. I have wondered every day since why. What I want you to understand is what happened to the village itself, because that is the part that matters, and the part I am ashamed of, and the part the man in the red coat answered. When the sickness was sure, when there was no more pretending it was the drover's road grip or a bad turn of the weather, the valley began to empty from the top down. Not the sick. The sick could not go anywhere. The strong went. The ones with somewhere to go and the legs to get there and a cart to carry their good things. Carrow had put a watch on the river road by then, men with staves who would let no one from up the valley come down, for fear of carrying the gray fever to the town. And I do not blame Carrow either, you understand. A town has a right to keep its own children alive. But the watch only turned back the poor, the ones on foot with nothing. The ones with means went around, over the shoulder of the hill by the old drove track that the watch did not hold, by night, quiet, before their neighbors could see them go and ask to be taken too. Thacker the wool factor went, who had the biggest house in Holt's Bottom and a strong cart and 2 horses, and he took his family and his money and his good furniture and left his servants standing in the yard. The miller went, and the 2 brothers who held the lease on the upper grazing, and the apothecary, God forgive him, the one man among us who knew the names of the things in his own jars. The apothecary went in the 3rd week in the dark, and took his powders with him and left a note on his door that said he had been called away on urgent business and would return when the air was clean. I read that note. We all read it. It is a hard thing to watch the people with the most, to be the first to find a reason to keep it. And so by the end of the month Holt's Bottom was the village everyone else had left. What was left in it was the part that could not leave, the old who could not walk the drove track, the sick who could not rise, the children whose parents were sick or dead, or had gone to the burying ground that we had stopped being able to keep up with, and the few of us, a handful, no more, who were whole and stubborn or simply had nowhere better and no heart to leave a dying neighbor to die alone. We were perhaps 60 souls where there had been 200, and most of the 60 were the ones any sensible flight would have left behind. The strong had gone over the hill. The weak were in the village. That was the arithmetic of it, and it was an old arithmetic, older than the fever, and I had never once in my life seen it written out so plain. It was into the emptied, the left behind, the village at the dead end of the forgotten valley, that the KingsGuard came. He did not come for us. I want that clear too, because it is the thing that makes the rest of it mean what it means. He was not sent. No one in the capital knew or cared that Holt's Bottom was dying. The realm did not yet know there was a fever in the high valleys at all. He was passing through, the way the drover had passed through, the way everything came to us from below on the river road on his way to somewhere that mattered. I saw him come. I was at the well in the small square with 2 buckets, because the carrying of water had become my work. It is plain heavy work, and a man it had walked past could do it, and the sick cannot carry their own, and I heard a horse on the lower road, which was a sound we had not heard in weeks, the watch at Carrow having stopped all coming and going. I straightened up with the rope in my hands and watched him ride into the square out of the gray, and I will tell you honestly that for a moment I thought I was looking at a thing out of a tale. He was a young man, though it was hard to say how young under the dirt of the road, and he wore the red coat. Not a soldier's plain field coat, the full dress of the king's own guard, scarlet wool gone dark at the shoulders with rain, the brass buttons and the high collar and the rest of it, though the tall black bearskin I had only ever heard described was strapped behind his saddle and he rode bareheaded. A carbine was slung at his back, a saber at his hip, and the horse under him was a tired good cavalry horse picking its feet up careful in the mud. A dispatch case was buckled across his chest. He was, I understood later, a king's messenger of the guard, carrying the king's letters to the garrison fort past the head of our valley. 11 days out from the capital, 3 from his fort, come up our river road because it was the only road, not knowing what was at the end of it. He drew rein in the middle of the square and looked at us. There were perhaps 4 of us about me at the well, the widow Hesk in her doorway, old Brennan who had taken to sitting on the chapel step because his legs would no longer take him home, and a girl of 7 or 8 named Nell who followed me everywhere those weeks because both her people were down with it and she had nowhere to put herself. He looked at the 4 of us, and then he looked past us, and I watched him read the village the way I imagine such men are trained to read a thing. The chapel door standing open and dark, the houses with the shutters closed at midday, the unswept lane, the look of us, the smell that I had stopped being able to smell but that must have hit him like a wall, and the long row of fresh-turned earth visible through the lich gate beyond the chapel that was the new part of the burying ground. "What place is this?" he said. His voice was level and carrying, a voice used to being heard across a parade. Holt's Bottom, sir, I said. And you want to ride on? There's fever here, the gray fever, it's the whole village. The town below has the road shut. You'll not get down again the way you came once they know where you've been. I said it fast, all of it, because it was the kindest thing I could say to a stranger, and because some mean small part of me wanted him gone before he saw the rest, before he saw what we had become, the village the realm forgot and the strong abandoned. Go round the bog by the eastern track and you'll strike the fort road clean. We've nothing for you here, sir. There's nothing here but the sick. He sat his horse and looked at me while I said it. He did not move. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and the only sound in the square was the bog water dripping off the chapel eaves. And then he asked me a question I have never forgotten, because it was not the question of a man looking for a way around us. "Who is left whole?" he said. "How many of you are on your feet to do the carrying?" I told him the truth because I did not have the wit to lie. 5, I said. 6 with old Brennan, but Brennan's done. We can't keep the water to them all and the fires and the burying. We're losing them faster than we can, and I stopped, because the girl Nell was standing by my leg, and you do not finish that sentence over a child. He looked at the burying ground a long moment. Then he swung down off his horse. I thought he had dismounted to lead it round the worst of the mud and be gone. I truly did. I have turned that moment over 1,000 times, the creak of the leather, his boots coming down into our mud, the way he stood a second with his hand on the horse's neck looking at the chapel, and I think now that the whole of the man was in that one motion, the getting down. Because a man riding through can tell himself he did not really see you. A man on the ground among you has decided something. He led the horse to the well trough, loosed the girth, and took the dispatch case off over his head, and he said, not to me especially, to the square, in that same level voice, "The king's letters can wait 3 days at a garrison fort. They cannot wait for me to have ridden past a thing I could have helped." He looped the horse's rein over the well post. "Where are your sick worst? Take me to them, and someone find me your headman." "We've no headman left, sir," I said. "Mr. Thacker that was headman went over the hill a fortnight since." Something moved in his face then, not much. I would learn that not much ever moved in his face, that the stillness was the man, but something. "Then you have one now until I'm gone," he said. "What's your name?" "Wat Coombe, sir, the smith." "Coombe?" He said it like he was filing it somewhere he would not lose it. "I'm Sergeant Aldous Rain of the KingsGuard. We've a great deal to do and not enough of us to do it, so we'll do it in an order, and the order is this: the living before the dead, the children before the grown, the water before the fires, and one man rested at all times, because a man who does not rest is a man you'll bury next. Do you understand me?" I did not really, not then. But I said yes, sir, because there is a kind of voice that gets a yes out of you before your understanding has caught up, and his was that kind. And that a stranger in a stained red coat, standing in our mud, drawing an order out of the chaos with 4 short rules, that was the beginning of the 11 days that saved Holt's Bottom. The first thing he did was the thing I had stopped being able to do, which was to look at the whole of it at once. We who were left whole had been working as men work when they are drowning, each at the nearest thing, each at the loudest grief, running from a child crying to a fire gone out to an old woman calling for water, and getting nowhere, and watching it all slide down regardless. The sergeant walked the whole village before he lifted a bucket. He went house to house with me at his shoulder, and he did not flinch from a single door, though I saw him pause on the threshold of each one and take a breath before he stepped in, the way a man steadies himself before cold water, and I understood that he was not unafraid, only that he had decided his fear was not going to be the one in charge. He counted the sick. He counted the whole. He found where the food was, and where the well was, and where the fuel was, and he found the things we had lost track of in our drowning. That the Hesk family had been 3 days without a fire because the widow could not split wood and was ashamed to ask. That 2 children at the lower end had been living alone in a house with both parents too sick to know it, eating cold and frightened in a corner. That old Brennan on the chapel step was not resting there but dying there slow, of nothing but exhaustion and the cold, and that no one had carried him home because no one had had a moment to see him. By dark of that first day he had it in his head, the whole village, every soul and where they lay, and he gave it back to us as work that could be done. He split us. One to the water, that stayed me. One to the fires and the wood, and he took the splitting of the wood onto himself in the mornings before the rest, scarlet coat off and his shirt sleeves rolled, because it was the heaviest and he was the strongest, and he had a soldier's hard sense that the strongest does the heaviest, rank be hanged. One to the broth, for he had got it into his head early, from God knows what hard campaign, that the sick who were given a thin warm broth with salt in it and made to drink, made to, spoonful by spoonful even when they turned their heads away, did better than the sick left to their thirst. And he was right. I will swear to my grave he was right. We lost fewer once the broth went round. And the children, the orphaned and the half-orphaned and the merely frightened, he gathered into one house, the chapel house that had been the curate's before the curate too had found urgent business elsewhere, and he set the two soundest of the old women over them, and he made it a rule, an iron rule, that that house was kept clean and warm and fed before any grown soul in the village, himself included. The children before the grown, he said, when Thacker's old foreman, who had stayed when his master ran and was a good hard man, muttered that the broth and the firewood were going to the little ones while strong men went cold. The sergeant did not raise his voice. He never once raised his voice the whole time he was among us. You and I chose to be here, he said. We can be cold. They didn't choose anything. A village that feeds its strong before it's small is a village that has decided what it's worth and decided wrong. The children before the grown, that's the order. And the foreman went red and then went and split wood beside him the rest of the morning and never said it again, and I think loved him a little by the end as we all came to. I should tell you about the girl Nell, because she is how I best know the kind of man he was. Nell was the child who had followed me since her people went down 7, perhaps 8, a thin, sharp little thing with both her mother and her father in the sick bed and an aunt already in the new ground, and she had stopped speaking. Not from being slow, she had been a chattering child before. She had simply gone quiet, the way the chapel bell had gone quiet, under a weight too heavy for the size of her. She would not go into the chapel house with the other children. She would not be more than 10 feet from a grown body she trusted, and for whatever reason that body had become first me and then, very fast, the sergeant. She trailed him through the village like a small shadow in a too big shawl, and he let her, and at first I thought he simply had not the time to shoo her off. But I saw, the second evening, what he was doing. He had finished the broth round and was sitting on the well edge with a bowl of it himself, the first food I had seen him take all day, and the child was standing the regulation 10 feet off, watching him with those flat, frightened eyes. And he did not coax her, and he did not pet her, and he did not say poor child the way the women did, which only ever made her flinch. He set the bowl down on the stone beside him, a little nearer to her than to himself, and he said, in the same level voice he gave to grown men, I'm going to want both hands in a minute. Will you mind that bowl so it doesn't go over? And he turned away as if it were nothing, as if he had asked a soldier to hold his pack, and went on with whatever he was doing with the straps of his dispatch case. And the child came and minded the bowl, because he had not asked her to be comforted, which she could not do. He had asked her to be useful, which she could. He had given her a post. I watched her stand over that bowl of broth as grave and fierce as any sentry at any palace gate in the realm, daring the world to spill it, and I understood that the man had not the first idea how to talk to a frightened child and had found, by some deep soldier's instinct, the one thing that worked. He had treated her as he would be treated, with a duty and the dignity of it. From that evening she was his. She carried things. She counted spoons. She stood her little watches. And slowly, over the days, she began again to speak. It would be a finer story if I could tell you the sergeant came and the dying stopped. It is not that kind of story. People still died. The gray fever did not care that there was a king's man in our square. It took 2 more in his first 3 days, and one was old Brennan, whom we had carried home at last and who slipped away in his own bed with the sergeant sitting up beside him, because the sergeant had said no one in Holt's Bottom would die alone while he was in it, and he kept that the way he kept everything, exactly. What changed was not that death stopped. What changed was that we stopped losing the ones we did not have to lose. The ones the fever would have spared but the cold or the thirst or the plain abandonment would have taken. The broth saved them, and the fire saved them, and the order saved them, and most of all I think the simple fact of a man who had looked at the whole of us and decided we were worth the saving saved them, because there is a strength that comes into people who have stopped believing they matter when one steady stranger acts as though they do. On the 5th day the rains came, and the valley tried to finish what the fever had begun. We were used to rain. We lived at the bottom of a wet country, and the bog was never dry. But this was the autumn rain that comes down off the high passes in a gray wall and does not stop, the kind the old people in the valley measured their lives by, the year of the great water, they would say, the way other places say the year of the war. It rained 2 days without a break. The river that had lost its nerve against the mountains found it again. It came up out of its banks in the dark of the 6th night, brown and fast and full of the whole hill's worth of water, and it took the lower road, the river road, the road the sergeant had come up, took it clean away, 100 yards of it, gone under a sliding brown flood with the drove track on the eastern shoulder washed to a mire above it. By the gray light of the 7th morning Holt's Bottom was an island. The way down was gone. The way over the hill was gone. We were cut off from the whole of the rest of the world, sick and few and alone at the dead end of the drowned valley, and the water was still rising toward the low houses at the bottom of the lane. I found the sergeant on the chapel step in the first light, looking at the flood where the road had been, and for the first and only time I let myself say the thing. "You should have gone round," I said. "That first morning, I told you to go round. You'd be at your fort by now, dry and your letters delivered, and you'd never have known any of it. Now you're shut in here to die with the rest of us, and the king's business is sat in a bog, and for what? We were always going to lose some. You can't stop the river. You can't stop the fever. A man with sense saves himself when he can't save anyone else." I said it cruelly because the flood had frightened the last of my hope out of me, and because some part of me wanted him to agree, wanted the king's own guard to tell me the strong were right to run, and I had been a fool to stay. I wanted him to break. I needed to see one strong man break so I would not feel so alone in my own breaking. He did not break. He looked at the flood a while, and then he looked at me, and there was no anger in it, only a kind of patience that was worse than anger because it was the patience of a man who had thought this through long before I had. "The men who went over the hill," he said, "when the fever passes, and it will pass, they'll come back. And they'll find the village standing, or they'll find it gone. That's the only question in front of any of us now, not whether we can save everyone, because no, you're right, we can't, and I've buried better men than you or me knowing it. The question is whether Holt's Bottom is here in the spring. A place is not its strong comb. A place is not the ones with carts. A place is whoever's left holding it when the worst comes, and the ones left holding this one are an old woman who can't split her own wood, and a smith, and a handful of frightened children, and a king's messenger who's 3 days late with his letters." He stood up off the step. "I can't stop the river. But I can put men where the water wants to come, and I can move your low houses to your high ground before it gets there, and I can keep your fires lit and your sick warm and your children fed for as long as it takes the water to remember it's supposed to run downhill. That's not nothing. That's the whole of it, in fact. That's all anyone's duty ever is, to hold the thing you're standing in front of, and not let go because letting go would be easier. I didn't ride past you. I'm not going to walk away from you now, because the road did." And then he said the thing I have carried 20 years, the thing I have told my own grandchildren, the thing that I think is the truest thing a man ever said to me in a hard place. "The road out being gone," he said, "doesn't change a single one of my duties. It only takes away my last excuse not to do them." Then he went down to the low houses in the rising water and began to carry people uphill. That 7th day was the longest of my life, and I have lived a good many since. The river came up the lane afoot in an hour, brown and cold and carrying the bog's filth, and at the bottom of the lane were the 4 poorest houses in Holt's Bottom, and in them were exactly the people a flood always finds first: the old, the sick, the ones who could not run. The sergeant had got the chapel up on the high ground marked as the place, stone-built, dry, on the only proper rise the village had, and we moved the whole of the living village into it that day, every soul on our backs and on the one cart, and on a door we tore off its hinges for a litter. He carried the most himself, and he carried the worst. There was a man at the lowest house, Sile the hurdle maker, who had the fever bad and weighed near as much as the sergeant and could not stand, and the water was already in his floor when we reached him. And I watched a single man lift a sick man near his own weight out of a flooding bed and carry him up 100 yards of running lane through water to his thighs, and not put him down, not once, not though I could see what it cost him in the cords of his neck and the set of his jaw, because to put a sick man down in that water was to lose him. He made 4 such trips that I saw and more that I did not. He went back into the last house when the water was at the windowsills for the widow Hesk's bedridden mother, who everyone but him had silently given up, who was the oldest soul in the village and the least used to anyone by the cold arithmetic of a flood, and he brought her out too, the last living soul below the flood line, held against his chest like she was the king's own letters. And when he set her down dry in the chapel, she put her hand on his face and called him by her dead son's name. And he let her and said, "Yes, mother, I'm here. You're safe now, because what was the harm in it?" The children he had moved first in the morning before the worst of it, the children before the grown always, his one unbreakable rule. And the girl Nell would not go up to the chapel with the others until she had been given a job to do, so he had given her one. She stood at the chapel door, dry and high and safe, and her post was to count us in. Every soul that came up out of the flood she counted, and she had the number he had given her, 61, written in her head, and she would not rest nor be comforted nor close that door until her count came right. It was full dark, and the rain still coming, and the whole village packed shivering into the cold chapel by the light of 2 lamps, when her small voice came clear down the nave for the first time in a month. 61, and then fierce to be sure none doubted her. "That's everyone I counted. That's everyone in." It was the first thing she had said aloud since her aunt went into the ground, and it was the whole of what the sergeant had done for us, said in a child's voice in 2 words, "Everyone in." He had come to a village the strong had abandoned and the realm forgot, and he had got every last one of the left behind up out of the flood and counted safe under one roof, and the counting of them was done by a child he had given back her voice by giving her a duty. I do not know how to tell you what that was like, to stand in that cold chapel and hear 61, that's everyone, after a month of losing people 1 and 2 at a time into the gray ground. Men who had not wept for their own dead wept then. I did. The sergeant did not. He only stood at the back by the door, soaked through and gray with cold and the long day, and when the child said everyone's in he gave a single short nod, the way I imagine he would have nodded to a sergeant of his own who had reported his post secure, and he said, "Good. Well counted." And then he sat down against the wall very suddenly, because he had been on his feet in cold water since first light, and even he had a bottom to the well of his strength. And the widow Hesk put a blanket over him as he sat, and he let her, and slept an hour, the first he had taken in 3 days. The water crested that night and began, as he had promised it would, to remember it was supposed to run downhill. The river went back into its bed over the next 2 days, slow and sullen, and left the lower village a ruin of mud, but left the people alive, every one, 61, in the chapel on the high ground. And somewhere in those same 2 days, I cannot give you the hour, sickness does not turn on an hour, the gray fever broke. It broke the way such things break, not all at once, but you could feel it go. The new cases stopped coming. The ones who had been wrestling it longest began, one by one, to ask for food, to sit up, to want the window opened, the small ungrand signs that a body has decided to live. The broth and the warmth and the order had held the village together long enough for the sickness to burn itself out, without taking the ones it would have taken from a village left to drown in its own despair. We did not lose another soul after the flood. We had buried 11 before the sergeant came and 4 while he was among us. We buried none after. The line of fresh earth through the lich gate stopped where it stopped, and grass grew over it in the spring. And it is still there, and I have kept it weeded for 20 years, all 11 of the before and all 4 of the during. And I keep them weeded for the sergeant's sake as much as for theirs, because he sat up with the during ones one by one so none would go alone, and a man who does that has bought the right to have the graves kept. On the 11th day the road came back, and so did the men who had left. It was a clear, cold morning, the first the valley had given us in a month, and the river was low and meek in its bed, and a party of men came up the half-mended drove track from below, Thacker the wool factor at the head of them, and the miller, and 2 of the apothecary's grown sons, with carts and good horses and a cautious look about them, come to see whether their houses still stood now that they had heard, down in Carrow where they had been waiting it out warm, that the fever was burning low. They had not come back to help. Let me be plain about that, as plain as I have tried to be about everything. They had come back to count what was theirs. They drew up at the edge of the village and looked at the chapel with the smoke of a good fire at its chimney, and the children's washing hung out in the cold sun, at the well swept and the lane being mended, at the village still standing that they had left to die. And they could not at first make sense of it, that it was whole, that we were alive, that the place they had abandoned to its week had outlasted the flood and the fever both. And then they saw the sergeant. He was at the well in his shirt sleeves, splitting the morning's wood as he had every morning, with the girl Nell stacking it small beside him, and chattering at him the way she chattered at everyone now, having got her whole self back. His scarlet coat hung drying on the chapel rail behind him, plain to see, the red of it the one bright thing in the gray morning. Thacker knew what that coat was. Every man in the realm knows what that coat is. And I watched the wool factor's face as he understood that while he had carried his money and his furniture over the hill in the dark, the king's own guard had come to the village he had abandoned, and had stayed in it, and had stood between his neighbors and the flood while he warmed himself in a Carrow inn. The sergeant set down the axe. He did not say anything cutting. He had no cutting in him. He only looked at Thacker a moment, the way he had looked at me that first morning, reading the whole man at a glance, and then he picked up the axe and went back to his wood, and that, the going back to his wood, the refusing even to spend a word on it, was a harder thing for Thacker to bear than any speech could have been. The wool factor stood there with his carts and his good horses and his returned importance, and found there was no place for it to land. The headman's chair he had run from was filled. The village he had given up on had been held by better hands than his. He got down off his cart after a while, and walked into the village with his hat in his hands like a man coming late to a church already full, and he did not meet anyone's eye, and he was a quieter man in Holt's Bottom ever after, and gave more and said less, and I will allow that the shame did him some good in the end. A man can learn. Even Thacker learned. But he learned it from the back of the church, and the sergeant had earned the front of it without ever once asking to stand there. The sergeant left us the next morning. His horse was rested, the road was open, and the king's letters were 3 days late, and a soldier's first duty calls him back to it. We tried to give him something, and he would take nothing. No payment, no gift, not the good cloak the women had mended for him, only food enough for the road and a fresh-shod horse, which I did for him myself, the one thing I had to give that was worth giving, the best work these hands have ever done. The whole village came out to the square to see him go, all 61 of us. The ones he had carried and the ones he had fed and the ones he had sat up beside. The left behind that the realm forgot and the strong abandoned. Everyone alive to stand in the cold and watch him buckle his dispatch case across his chest. He put on the coat then, the full scarlet, and the tall black bearskin out of its strapping, and where there had been a tired man splitting wood in his shirt sleeves, there was suddenly the KingsGuard entire, immaculate even stained with our valley, drawn up straight as a gate post in our muddy square. And I understood for the first time that the man and the coat were the same thing, that the discipline I had taken for a stranger's stiffness on that first gray morning was the very thing that had saved us. That a man who will stand a post in the cold for no one's thanks at a palace gate is exactly the man who will hold a drowning village for 11 days and ride off asking nothing. The stillness was never coldness. It was the shape strength takes when it has decided not to leave. The girl Nell broke from the crowd and ran to him, the way she would never have run to anyone a month before, and stood her 10 feet off, and could not find the words after all, having only just got them back. And the sergeant looked down at her, and he did the only soft thing I ever saw him do in 11 days. He bent down the bearskin and the brass and all of it to her height, which a KingsGuard does not do, which is breaking every rule of the coat he wore, and he said something to her quiet that none of the rest of us heard. Then he straightened and touched 2 fingers to the brim of the bearskin to her, a sentry's grave salute, soldier to soldier, the same he would have given a general to a 7-year-old in a too big shawl who had counted us all in out of the flood. And he mounted and turned the tired good horse down the Emptied road and was gone. I asked her years after what he had said to her that morning in the square. She was a grown woman by then, married with children of her own, and she still kept his words the way I kept the graves. He said I'd stood a hard watch, she told me, and that I'd stood it well, and that the village was mine to keep an eye on now because I'd proved I would. She smiled a little. He gave me a post, what? He was always giving people posts. I think that was the whole of how he saved us. He gave every frightened person in this village a duty too big to leave, and then he made us see that we were the kind who don't. That is the truest thing anyone has said of him, and I have nothing to add to it but this. The realm did not send him. The realm did not know we existed. The strong did not stay. The strong are not always the ones a place can count on. We were the village everyone else left, the poor and the old and the sick and the small, the part of the world that is always there to be abandoned when the road out is open, and the easy thing is to take it. And one tired soldier in a stained red coat, who could have ridden past and never been the worse for it, got down off his horse into our mud instead, and stayed and held us and counted us safe, and rode away poorer by nothing but 11 days and richer, I have to believe, by the only wealth a man like that ever wanted, the knowing that he had not let go. He held the thing he was standing in front of. That was all. That was everything. And in 20 years of turning it over, I have never found a finer word for honor than a soldier in our square saying, plainly, that the road being gone only took away his last excuse, and then going down to the water to carry the old and the small uphill, one at a time, until everyone was in.